May 1944, Camp Civili, Pickens County, Alabama, a U.S. Army convoy delivered approximately 400 German prisoners of war captured during the North African campaign. These men, primarily from Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps and associated Wehrmacht units, had been interned in North Africa following the Axis surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, then transported across the Atlantic to detention facilities in the United States. Camp Ellisville was one of approximately 700 prisoner of war camps established across the continental United States between 1942 and 1946. The facility, constructed in late 1943, was designed to hold up to 6,000 enemy combatants and operated under protocols established by the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, an international agreement that Germany had read. The prisoners arriving that May morning had experienced significant deprivation. Medical records from the camp's initial intake procedures indicate widespread malnutrition, dehydration, and exhaustion. Many had subsisted on minimal rations during their final months in North Africa and subsequent transport. Wehrmacht supply chains in Tunisia had collapsed by early 1943, leaving frontline troops with inadequate food, water, and medical supplies. German military propaganda had prepared these soldiers for harsh treatment in Allied captivity. Ministry of Propaganda materials recovered after the war show systematic efforts to convince German troops that capture by American or British forces would result in torture, forced labor without adequate provisions, and potential execution. This messaging intensified after 1943 as Germany's military position deteriorated. The physical layout of Camp Ellisville reflected standard U.S. Army POW camp design. Wooden barracks arranged in company-sized groupings, perimeter fencing with guard towers at regular intervals, and separate facilities for administration, medical care, and food service. The camp occupied approximately 400 acres and employed both military guards and civilian support staff. Upon arrival, prisoners underwent standard processing, medical examination, delousing, issuance of clean clothing, and assignment to barracks. These procedures, documented in camp administrative records now held at the National Archives, were consistent with Geneva Convention requirements for humane treatment and sanitary conditions. If you're interested in evidence-based World War II history that examines lesser-known aspects of the conflict, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We'd like to know where our viewers are located geographically. The disconnect between expected treatment and actual conditions was immediate and documented in multiple sources. Prisoner testimonies collected by camp officials, letters intercepted by censors, and post-war interviews all referenced the surprise expressed by German posts upon arrival at the barracks. While basic included beds with mattresses, blankets, and functional sanitation facilities, conditions that exceeded those experienced by many prisoners during their final weeks in North Africa. Camp Commander Captain Robert Hanley, a 1938 West Point graduate who had served in North Africa with the 1st Infantry Division, implemented policies that strictly adhered to Geneva Convention standards. His approach, according to military correspondence preserved in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, emphasized that proper treatment of enemy prisoners would serve strategic purposes, demonstrating American adherence to international law, potentially encouraging German desertions or surrenders, and establishing moral authority in contrast to Axis treatment of Allied posts. The first meal provided to the newly arrived prisoners became a significant event in camp history. Kitchen records show that each prisoner received approximately 3,200 calories that evening, roughly equivalent to the daily Russia provided to U.S. Army combat troops. This contrasted sharply with German military rations in 1944, which had been reduced to approximately 2,000 to 2,500 calories for frontline troops and significantly less for posts in German custody. The meal components included beef roast, potatoes, vegetables, bread, butter, and milk coal, sourced through standard U.S. Army supply channels. The U.S. War Department had established clear guidelines. Enemy prisoners were to receive the same quality and quantity of rations as American soldiers in training camps. This policy applied to all POW facilities, regardless of location. Medical staff at Camp Aliceville documented numerous cases of digestive distress among newly arrived prisoners who consumed food rapidly after extended periods of inadequate nutrition. The camp physician's reports note the need to monitor feeding patterns and provide nutritional education to prevent medical complications from sudden dietary changes. The United States treatment of Axis prisoners during World War II was governed primarily by the 1929 Geneva Convention, which established minimum standards for POW treatment. The U.S. War Department issued detailed regulations implementing these requirements across all domestic detention facilities. Between 1942 and 1946, approximately 425,000 prisoners of war were held in United States territory. This included roughly 371,000 Germans, 50,000 Italians, and 4,000 Japanese. The concentration of POW camps in southern and southwestern states reflected both security considerations and economic factors agricultural regions could utilize. Prisoner labor, while keeping detainees far from coastal areas vulnerable to submarine activity. Geneva Convention provisions specified that prisoners must receive adequate food, shelter, medical care, and opportunities for recreation and correspondence. Enlisted prisoners could be required to work, but not in war-related industries or under hazardous conditions. Officers could not be compelled to perform labor. All prisoners were to be paid for work performed, though payment could be in the form of camp scrip rather than U.S. currency. Camp Aliceville's administrative structure reflected standard U.S. Army organization. The camp commander reported to the Provost Marshal General's office, which oversaw all POW operations. Military police companies provided security, while the camp included officers responsible for intelligence, labor, coordination, food service, medical care, and prisoner welfare. Daily routines at Camp Aliceville, documented in operational reports, followed consistent pattern. Prisoners woke at 0600 hours for a roll call, received breakfast at 0700, and were assigned to work details or educational activities. Lunch was served at noon, with work continuing until 1700 hours. Evening meals occurred at 1800, followed by free time for recreation, reading, or organized activities. Lights out was enforced at 2200 hours. The camp maintained a library with German language materials, including newspapers, books, and periodicals. Geneva Convention provisions required that prisoners have access to intellectual and recreational resources. Sports equipment was provided, and prisoners organized soccer, which became regular weekend events that guards sometimes observed. Medical care exceeded minimum Geneva Convention requirements. The camp included a fully equipped infirmary with American military physicians and medics. Sick call was held daily, and serious cases could be transferred to military hospitals if necessary. Mortality rates among posts in U.S. custody were remarkably low, less than 1% across all camps, compared to approximately 40% for Allied prisoners in Japanese custody and 57% for Soviet prisoners in German custody. The wage system for prisoner labor followed federal guidelines. Prisoners received 80 cents per day for work performed, paid in canteen coupons that could be used to purchase items like cigarettes, toiletries, and snacks. This amount, while modest, represents more purchasing power than many prisoners had access to before capture. Canteen records show that chocolate, tobacco, and writing materials were the most frequently purchased items. Food provision at Camp Ellisville utilized the same supply system that provisioned U.S. military installations. The camp's monthly food allocation, detailed in quartermaster reports, included approximately 12,000 pounds of meat, 8,000 pounds of fresh vegetables, 15,000 pounds of bread and baked goods, and 2,000 gallons of milk. These quantities ensured that prisoners received nutritionally adequate meals that met or exceeded Geneva Convention standards. The contrast with German POW camps was stark and documented in multiple sources. Red Cross inspection reports from 1944 to 1945 show that Allied prisoners in German camps frequently received less than 1,500 calories daily, with conditions deteriorating significantly as German supply systems collapsed. Soviet prisoners in German custody faced even worse treatment, with systematic starvation contributing to millions of deaths. The utilization of prisoner of war labor in American agriculture addressed critical wartime labor shortages. By 1944, approximately 12 million American men served in the military, creating severe deficits in agricultural and industrial sectors. The War Manpower Commission authorized the use of POW labor to maintain agricultural production essential to the war effort. German prisoners from Camp Ellisville were assigned to work programs in surrounding Alabama counties. Labor details typically included 20 to 40 prisoners supervised by 2 to 4 guards. Work sites included cotton fields, soybean farms, timber operations, and vegetable farms. Geneva Convention regulations prohibited using prisoners for directly war-related work, so assignments focused on agricultural production and infrastructure maintenance. Farmers who employed POW labor paid the U.S. government for their services typically $3 per prisoner per day. This rate was competitive with civilian agricultural wages at the time. The government retained most of this payment, with prisoners receiving their 80-cent daily wage in canteen coupons. This system generated revenue that partially offset the costs of operating POW camps. Work schedules adhered to Geneva Convention limitations. Prisoners could not be required to work more than 10 hours daily. They were entitled to 1 rest day per week. Guards monitored conditions to ensure compliance with safety standards and humane treatment. Violations, while rare, were subject to investigation by the Provost Marshal General's office. Agricultural work provided prisoners with experiences that contrasted dramatically with conditions in combat zones. Access to abundant food, interaction with civilian farmers, and exposure to American rural life challenged propaganda narratives about American society. Prisoner testimonies collected after the war frequently referenced these work assignments as significant factors in changing their perceptions. The relationship between prisoners and civilian farmers varied. Some farmers maintained strict separation and minimal communication. Others, particularly in rural areas where labor was desperately needed, developed more informal relationships with their temporary workforce. Instances of farmers sharing meals with prisoner work crews appear in multiple oral history accounts, though such practices technically violated protocols requiring separation between prisoners and civilians. Economic data shows that POW labor made measurable contributions to southern agriculture during 1944-1945. In Alabama alone, prisoners worked approximately 3 million man-days in agriculture, logging, and other non-military industries. This labor helped maintain production levels despite wartime manpower shortages that threatened to reduce agricultural output. Security incidents involving German posts in the United States were relatively rare. Of approximately 371,000 German prisoners held in U.S. custody, fewer than 5,000 escape attempts were recorded. Most escapees were recaptured within days. The low escape rate reflected multiple factors: the remote locations of many camps, the difficulty of evading capture in an unfamiliar country, and the recognition among many prisoners that conditions in American custody were preferable to the alternatives. The Geneva Convention guaranteed prisoners the right to correspond with family members in their home countries. The International Red Cross facilitated mail delivery through neutral nations, primarily Switzerland. This correspondence system, while slow and subject to censorship, provided crucial communication links between prisoners and their families. Camp Civili, like all ESPOW facilities, maintained a censorship office staffed by personnel fluent in German. Every letter written by prisoners and every letter received was examined for intelligence, value, and security concerns. Censors were authorized to redact or block content that discussed military matters, camp security, or sensitive political topics. However, personal content and descriptions of treatment were generally permitted. Prisoners were typically allowed to write 2 letters and 4 postcards per month. Writing materials were provided at no cost. The letters, written on standardized forms, were limited in length, usually 1 or 2 pages. This restriction reflected both security considerations and the volume of mail that required processing. The time required for mail to travel between the United States and Germany varied significantly. During 1944, letters typically took 6 to 10 weeks to reach their destinations via Red Cross channels through neutral countries. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, mail service became even more unreliable as the German postal system collapsed and the country was divided into occupation zones. Censorship records from Camp Aliceville, preserved in National Archives collections, provide insights into prisoner attitudes and morale. Letters from early 1944 often express confusion about their treatment. Many prisoners struggled to reconcile their experiences with what they had been told to expect. By late 1944 and early 1945, letters increasingly reflected acceptance of their circumstances and insomikazi's appreciation for the conditions they experienced. The content of letters received by prisoners revealed the deteriorating situation in Germany. References to Allied bombing raids, food shortages, and military defeats became more common as the war progressed. Censors noted that many prisoners experienced significant psychological distress upon learning about conditions at home, particularly reports of family members killed in air raids or displaced by advancing Allied forces. Some prisoners used their correspondence to describe their treatment in ways that contradicted German propaganda. These descriptions, when they reached Germany, potentially influenced public perception and morale. German authorities were aware of this phenomenon and attempted to suppress such letters. Though their ability to control information flow was limited, the psychological impact of correspondence was significant. Camp mental health records indicate that prisoners who maintained regular contact with family members demonstrated better morale and fewer behavioral problems. Conversely, prisoners who received no mail or learned of family tragedies showed increased rates of depression and disciplinary issues. After Germany's surrender, the correspondence system's function changed. Letters increasingly focused on prospects for repatriation and concerns about conditions in occupied Germany. The collapse of German governmental structures meant that many letters went unanswered. As addresses became invalid and families were displaced or deceased, the ideological composition of German POW populations in American camps varied significantly. Early arrivals, particularly from the Afrika Korps, included professional soldiers with relatively moderate political views. Later arrivals, captured during the campaigns in Italy and France, included higher proportions of committed National Socialists and younger soldiers who had been more thoroughly indoctrinated by Nazi educational systems. U.S. military intelligence conducted systematic screening of posts to identify hardcore war criminals and potential collaborators. This screening process, documented in G2 intelligence reports, involved interviews, observation of prisoner interactions, and analysis of camp dynamics. Identified Nazi activists were segregated into separate facilities to prevent them from intimidating or controlling other prisoners. Camp Ellisville's population included relatively few hardcore Nazis compared to some other facilities. Most prisoners were regular Wehrmacht conscripts who had demonstrated limited ideological commitment. This demographic composition facilitated the gradual erosion of National Socialist ideology that camp officials observed over time. The U.S. Army implemented a re-education program for German POWs starting in 1944. This program, administered by the Special Projects Division, aimed to expose prisoners to democratic values, accurate information about Nazi atrocities, and American culture. The program's effectiveness remains debated among historians, but camp records show that many prisoners voluntarily participated in educational activities, including English classes, political discussions, and screenings of newsreels documenting Nazi crimes. Access to uncensored news was a significant factor in ideological change. Camp newspapers, prepared in German by U.S. military personnel, provided prisoners with accurate information about the war's progress. By late 1944, these publications documented Germany's military collapse in detail, the Soviet advance into Eastern Europe, the Allied liberation of France and Belgium, and the increasing devastation of German cities through strategic bombing. The revelation of Nazi concentration camp atrocities had profound effects on prisoner attitudes. In April and May 1945, Allied forces liberated major concentration camps, including photographs and newsreel footage documenting these sites were shown to post as part of the re-education program. Prisoner reactions, documented in camp reports, ranged from disbelief to horror to some prisoners rejected the evidence of Nazi atrocities as propaganda. However, the volume and consistency of documentation made denial increasingly difficult to sustain. Post-war surveys of repatriated posts suggest that exposure to this evidence significantly influenced their post-war political attitudes, though the extent of lasting impact varied by individual. The camp's social structure evolved as the war progressed. Early in 1944, camp leadership positions were often held by senior German officers who maintained military discipline in some cases, Nazi ideology. By 1945, as Germany's defeat became certain, this authority structure weakened. Younger prisoners increasingly questioned their leaders, and debates about Germany's future became common. Religious services provided an alternative social structure. The camp included both Protestant and Catholic chaplains, and religious observances were well attended. Some prisoners found in religious faith a way to process their experiences and construct meaning beyond the Nazi ideology. May 7, 1945. Germany's unconditional surrender. The news reached Camp Ellisville through official military channels and radio broadcasts. For the German prisoners, the announcement marked the definitive end of the war and the end of any remaining hope that Germany might avoid total defeat. Camp commanders anticipated potential security problems or unrest. following Germany's surrender. However, records indicate that the response at Camp Allesville was predominantly subdued. Most prisoners had recognized the inevitability of defeat for months. The official announcement simply confirmed what had been evident since the fall of Berlin in late April. The immediate practical question was, what would happen to them now? Geneva Convention provisions specified that prisoners should be repatriated without delay after cessation of hostilities. However, the logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of POWs to a devastated, occupied Germany were complex. The US military made clear that repatriation would occur gradually, based on available transportation and conditions in occupied zones. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, camp routines continued largely unchanged. Work programs proceeded, though the theoretical justifications supporting the war effort no longer applied. The War Department determined that maintaining prisoners' employment served practical purposes. It prevented boredom and disciplinary problems while continuing to address labor shortages in American agriculture. The psychological impact of defeat varied among prisoners. Some expressed relief that the war had ended without further bloodshed. Others struggled with shame and uncertainty about their futures. Camp mental health records from June 1945 show increased reports of depression, anxiety, and concerns about family members in occupied Germany. Access to detailed information about conditions in Germany was limited and often disturbing. Newsreels and newspapers documented the extent of destruction in German cities, the collapse of civil infrastructure, and the hardships facing the civilian population. Prisoners learned that many of their home cities had been reduced to rubble, that millions were homeless and starving, and that Germany itself had ceased to exist as a sovereign state. The discovery and documentation of the Holocaust intensified prisoner disillusionment. While some prisoners had known about persecution of Jews and other groups, the systematic nature and scale of the genocide shocked even those who had served in the Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, provided detailed evidence that was impossible to dismiss. Camp officials observed that prisoners' attitudes toward their captors continued to evolve after Germany's surrender. Many expressed gratitude for their treatment in American custody, particularly when compared with reports about Soviet treatment of German prisoners. Approximately 3 million German soldiers had been captured by Soviet forces, and reports of harsh conditions, forced labor, and high mortality rates circulated widely. The repatriation of German prisoners from the United States began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. The process was complicated by multiple factors. Limited shipping capacity, destroyed transportation infrastructure in Europe, political disagreements among the Allies about POW labor, and concerns about prisoner screening to identify war criminals. The sequence of repatriation was determined by several criteria. Priority was given to prisoners with specialized skills needed for German reconstruction, those with documented medical needs, and those from regions not under Soviet control. The US military also prioritized returning anti-Nazi prisoners who might contribute to democratic development in occupied Germany. Transportation arrangements involved converting military vessels that had carried troops to Europe into ships capable of transporting prisoners back. Each vessel could carry several thousand prisoners, but the Atlantic crossing took approximately 2 weeks. Given the total POW population of over 370,000 Germans in US custody, the logistics were substantial. At Camp Allesville, repatriation began in late 1945. Prisoners selected for early return underwent final processing, medical examinations, verification of identity documents, and interviews to confirm their legal status. Those suspected of war crimes or significant Nazi activity were separated for further investigation by Allied authorities. The journey home was typically complex. Prisoners were first transported to embarkation ports on the East Coast, usually in New York or Norfolk. From there, they crossed the Atlantic to European ports, most commonly Le Havre in France or Southampton in England. Upon arrival in Europe, they were processed through Allied reception centers before being transported to their assigned occupation zones. Conditions in Germany presented stark contrasts to their experiences in American camps. Germany in 1946 faced catastrophic destruction. Approximately 20% of housing stock destroyed. Industrial production at 20% of pre-war levels. Transportation systems severely damaged, and severe food shortages affecting the entire population. The Allies implemented occupation policies that initially limited German sovereignty and imposed strict controls on political and economic activity. Many repatriated prisoners found that their homes no longer existed or were in occupation zones they could not access. Germany's divisioned into 4 occupation zones. American, British, French, and Soviet meant that prisoners from eastern regions often could not return to their original homes if those areas were now under Soviet control. Displacement and family separation were common experiences. The Allied Control Council authorized limited use of German POWs for reconstruction labor in Europe before repatriation. Some prisoners from American camps were transferred to British or French custody to work on rebuilding projects. This practice, while controversial, was justified on the grounds that Germany owed labor to help repair the damage it had caused. Britain and France were particularly reluctant to release German POWs quickly. Both countries faced severe labor shortages and used German prisoners extensively in agriculture, mining, and reconstruction. France held significant numbers of German POWs until and the last German prisoners did not leave Soviet custody until the mid-1950s. By December 1946, Camp Aliceville had been closed and all prisoners repatriated or transferred to other facilities. The camp's physical structures were eventually dismantled or repurposed for civilian use. The site today includes a museum dedicated to preserving the camp's history and the experiences of those who were imprisoned there. The treatment of prisoners of war during World War II varied dramatically depending on who held them and where. These differences reflected both practical factors, resource availability, proximity to combat zones, and ideological factors, particularly regarding racial hierarchies and the perceived value of human life. German treatment of prisoners followed distinct patterns based on the prisoner's nationality. Western Allied prisoners, British, American, French, generally received treatment that roughly conformed to Geneva Convention standards, though conditions deteriorated as Germany's resources declined. Red Cross parcels provided crucial supplemental food, and mortality rates remained relatively low, approximately 3 to 4% for British and American prisoners. Soviet prisoners in German custody faced drastically different treatment. Nazi racial ideology regarded Slavic peoples as inferior, and the Wehrmacht and SS implemented policies of deliberate starvation and neglect. Of approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany, roughly 3.3 million died in captivity, a mortality rate of 57%. This systematic mistreatment constituted war crimes under international law. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners was similarly brutal. Approximately 27% of Allied prisoners in Japanese custody died, compared to 4% of Allied prisoners in German custody. Japanese military culture regarded surrender as deeply dishonorable, and captured soldiers were treated with contempt. Forced Labor on projects like the Burma Railway resulted in thousands of deaths from exhaustion, disease, and abuse. American treatment of prisoners, by contrast, maintained high standards throughout the war. The mortality rate for access prisoners in U.S. custody was approximately 1%. This reflected adequate food, medical care, and housing, as well as strict enforcement of Geneva Convention protocols. The U.S. policy emphasized both humanitarian concerns and strategic considerations. Proper treatment of prisoners served propaganda purposes and potentially encouraged enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. The resource disparity between the United States and Axis powers contributed significantly to these differences. The U.S. homeland was never threatened with invasion. Its agricultural and industrial systems operated at full capacity throughout the war, and it could afford to feed prisoners adequately. Germany and Japan, facing severe resource constraints by 1944 to 1945, could barely feed their own populations and military forces, making adequate POW care extremely difficult even if the will had existed. British treatment of prisoners generally adhered to Geneva Convention standards, though conditions varied by location. Camps in Britain maintained reasonable conditions, while camps in North Africa and the Middle East faced challenges due to harsh climate and limited resources. Italian prisoners in British custody often worked in agriculture, similar to German prisoners in the United States. Soviet treatment of German prisoners combined ideological hatred with practical exploitation. Approximately 3 million German soldiers entered Soviet captivity, with mortality rates estimated at 15 to 33% depending on period and location. Prisoners faced forced labor and harsh conditions, inadequate food, and minimal medical care. The last German prisoners were not released from Soviet camps until 19. The contrast between treatment standards had significant post-war implications. German soldiers desperately sought to surrender to Western allies rather than Soviet forces in the war's final months. The memory of humane treatment in American and British custody influenced German attitudes toward the Western allies during the Cold War period. Conversely, Soviet mistreatment of German prisoners contributed to decades of resentment and complicated Soviet-German relations. Camp Pallasfield operated from December 1943 until December 1946, processing approximately 6,000 German prisoners during its operational period. The camp's history exemplifies broader patterns in American POW treatment during World War II, while also illustrating the specific experiences of German soldiers held in the American South. The camp's location in rural Alabama reflected strategic considerations common to POW camp placement. Remote inland locations provided security against escape while placing prisoners in regions where their labor could address critical agricultural workforce shortages. Alabama's agricultural sector, heavily dependent on cotton and timber production, faced severe labor deficits as men enlisted or were drafted into military service. Economic impact studies show that POW labor made measurable contributions to Alabama's wartime agricultural production. German prisoners from Camp Pallasville worked approximately 500,000 man-days in 1944 alone, primarily in cotton harvesting, soybean cultivation, and timber operations. This labor helped maintain production levels that would otherwise have declined significantly. The camp's role in challenging Nazi propaganda was perhaps its most significant historical contribution. Prisoners arrived expecting brutality and deprivation based on German propaganda. Their actual experiences, adequate food, medical care, opportunities for recreation, and education contradicted these narratives. Post-war interviews with former prisoners frequently cite their time in American camps as transformative experiences that that forced them to reconsider Nazi ideology. Documentation of the camp's operations provides valuable historical evidence about POW treatment standards. Administrative records, including camp commander reports, medical logs, censorship summaries, and disciplinary records, are preserved in the National Archives. These documents offer detailed insights into daily operations, challenges faced by camp administrators, and prisoner experiences. The camp employed approximately 300 military personnel and 100 civilian workers at its peak. Guard duty fell primarily to military police units, many of whom had been deemed unsuitable for combat deployment due to age, medical conditions, or other factors. Civilian employees handled food service, maintenance, and administrative functions. Security incidents at Camp Aliceville were rare and generally minor. Escape attempts numbered fewer than a dozen during the camp's operation, with all escapees recaptured within days. Disciplinary problems typically involved minor infractions, violations of camp rules, disputes between prisoners, or occasional contraband possession. Serious violence was virtually absent. The re-education program implemented at Camp Aliceville beginning in 1944 aimed to expose prisoners to democratic values and accurate information about Nazi atrocities. The program's effectiveness remains debated. Some prisoners embraced the opportunity to learn about American democracy and rejected Nazi ideology. Others remained skeptical or resistant. Post-war surveys suggest that younger prisoners were more receptive to re-education than older, more ideologically committed individuals. After the war, some former Camp Aliceville prisoners maintained contact with Americans they had met during their captivity. A few returned to the United States as immigrants in subsequent years. These personal connections represent the lasting human impact of the camp's operation and the relationships that developed despite the context of war. The campsite today serves as a historical memory site. The Camp Aliceville Museum, opened in 1993, preserves artifacts, photographs, and testimonies from the camp's operation. The museum's collection includes prisoner artwork, letters, personal items, and administrative documents that provide material evidence of the camp's history. Scholarly interest in Camp Aliceville reflects broader academic attention to POW experiences during World War II. Historians have used the camp's records to analyze implementation of Geneva Convention standard, the effectiveness of re-education programs, the economic impact of POW labor, and the psychological experiences of captivity. The camp represents a valuable case study in humane prisoner treatment during wartime. The treatment of prisoners during World War II significantly influenced the post-war development of international humanitarian law. The experiences of POWs in various custody arrangements demonstrated both the importance of established standards and the need for stronger enforcement mechanisms. The 1929 Geneva Convention had provided a framework for POW treatment, but World War II revealed significant gaps. The Convention's protections did not extend to civilian population, and its enforcement mechanisms proved inadequate when nations chose to ignore its provisions. The massive scale of atrocities committed against both military prisoners and civilians demonstrated the need for more comprehensive protections. In 1949, the international community adopted 4 new Geneva Conventions that expanded protections significantly. The Third Geneva Convention, specifically addressing POW treatment, incorporated lessons from World War II. It strengthened provisions regarding adequate food and medical care, prohibited reprisals against prisoners, established more robust inspection mechanisms, and clarified that prisoners could not be prosecuted for simply participating in combat. American treatment of Axis prisoners during World War II became a reference point in developing these new standards. The relatively low mortality rates, adequate living conditions, and opportunities for communication with families demonstrated that humane treatment was feasible even for enemy combatants from hostile ideologies. U.S. practices during the war influenced provisions in the 1949 conventions regarding work assignments, compensation, food standards, and disciplinary procedures. The contrast between American and Soviet POW treatment also influenced Cold War narratives. The United States highlighted its adherence to Geneva Convention standards as evidence of democratic values and respect for human dignity. The Soviet Union's harsh treatment of German prisoners became part of Western arguments about fundamental differences between democratic and communist systems. Post-war prosecutions for war crimes included charges related to POW mistreatment. The Nuremberg trials addressed German mistreatment of Soviet prisoners, while the Tokyo trials examined Japanese atrocities against Allied POWs. These prosecutions established precedents that mistreatment of prisoners constituted serious war crimes subject to individual criminal responsibility. The Cold War period tested continued adherence to POW standards. During the Korean War in 1952-1953, both sides accused each other of violating Geneva Convention provisions. Communist forces' treatment of UN prisoners, particularly during the death marches and in camps near the Yalu River, resulted in significant casualties and post-war controversy. American treatment of North Korean and Chinese prisoners was generally better, though the contentious issue of forced repatriation complicated the war's resolution. The Vietnam War, 1965 to 1975, presented new challenges to POW standards. North Vietnam did not fully comply with Geneva Convention provisions regarding American prisoners, while controversies arose regarding U.S. treatment of Viet Cong prisoners and the status of detainees held by South Vietnamese forces. These disputes highlighted ongoing difficulties in enforcing international humanitarian law during asymmetric conflicts. More recent conflicts have continued to raise questions about POW standards and their application, the status of detainees captured during counterterrorism operations, the treatment of prisoners at facilities like Guantanamo Bay, and debates about enhanced interrogation techniques. All reflect ongoing tensions between security concerns and humanitarian principles established in the Geneva Conventions. The legacy of camps like Alasvel remains relevant to contemporary debates about prisoner treatment. The historical evidence that humane treatment can be implemented even during total war, that such treatment serves strategic as well as humanitarian purposes, and that prisoners can be effectively managed without resorting to abuse. All of these lessons continue to inform policy, discussions, and legal frameworks. International humanitarian law has expanded significantly beyond POW treatment to address civilian protection, internal armed conflicts, and humanitarian intervention. The core principles established in the Geneva Convention's distinction between combatants and civilians, prohibition of unnecessary suffering, and requirements for humane treatment remain foundational to modern international humanitarian law.